Welcome to our deep dive, into Yom Kippur. We're going to be exploring excerpts from MCS Leviticus chapter 16, and not just looking at the rituals, but why they matter, like a journey back in time, you could say, to unpack how ancient Israelites approached repentance and atonement.
Yeah, and it's interesting, even though these are ancient practices, the core themes of Yom Kippur, they resonate deeply with human experience across cultures, across time, really.
Exactly. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, wasn't just like another holiday. It was a day of fasting and reflection and really deep spiritual cleansing. And we're going to see how seriously they took this idea of cleansing. When we look at the story of Aaron and his sons in Leviticus 16:1 to 2.
Yeah, those verses are like a stark reminder of the reverence that's required when you're approaching the divine.
Yeah.
Aaron's sons, remember, they offered strange fire before God. It's essentially worshiping him properly.
Yeah.
And it had, fatal consequences.
It really sets the tone for understanding like the gravity of the Day of Atonement, doesn't
Yeah.
it? Like everything has to be done exactly right.
Absolutely. And that meticulousness, it's evident in the preparations that Aaron himself had to undertake before even entering the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space in the tabernacle.
Leviticus goes into a lot of detail about these preparations.
Right.
Bathing specific garments. It almost reads like a divine instruction manual.
It does, and that's exactly the point. It wasn't just about physical cleanliness. Each act symbolized a deeper spiritual cleansing, a purification necessary to stand before God.
Speaking of purification, the ritual of the scapegoat, it's one of the most visually powerful elements of Yom Kippur, isn't it? You have two goats, seemingly identical, but their fates are completely different.
Yeah, it's a brilliant piece of symbolism. One goat becomes a sin offering, sacrifice to God. The other, the scapegoat, is sent into the wilderness, carrying the sins of the community.
Imagine the weight of that moment, the high priest literally transferring the confessed sins of the entire Israelite community onto this one animal.
And the visual of that scapegoat disappearing into the wilderness, symbolically carrying those sins away, must have been incredibly powerful for the people watching. It was a tangible representation of their desire to be cleansed, to start anew.
So the scapegoat was part of this purification process, but it didn't end there, did it? What happened once Aaron was purified and entered the Holy of Holies?
This is where we see the culmination of the atonement rituals. Aaron burns incense, symbolizing the presence of God, and then sprinkles the blood of the sacrificed bull on the Ark of the Covenant, representing the giving of life for the sake of atonement.
So every action, every element was imbued with this deep symbolic meaning. It wasn't just going through the motions.
Exactly. The rituals were meant to purify not just the people, but also the place of worship, the tent of meeting. It was believed that God's presence could only dwell among a purified people, in a purified space.
It's almost like, prepping your house for a really important guest. You want everything to be clean and in order.
That's a great analogy. And another crucial point is that these atonement rituals, they could only be performed by the high priest, highlighting the solemnity and the sacredness of the act.
Right. It wasn't something just anyone could do. This idea of a designated individual performing the atonement. It foreshadows the Christian concept of Jesus as the ultimate high priest, the one who ultimately atones for humanity's sins.
That's a connection a lot of scholars have drawn. The author of Leviticus might be deliberately hinting at this future fulfillment.
So we see a lot of emphasis on purifying people and the place of worship. But even the altar itself needed to be purified, using the blood of both the bull and the goat, sprinkled 7 times.
Yeah, the number 7, it holds significance throughout the Bible, representing holiness and completion. So sprinkling the blood 7 times emphasized the thoroughness, the absolute nature of the purification. It was a powerful symbol of wiping the slate clean, so to speak.
And it wasn't just a one-time thing either. This Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, was to be an annual observance, a permanent regulation for the Israelites.
This annual observance, it underscored the ongoing need for purification and reconciliation with God. It recognized that humans are fallible, constantly in need of course correction and spiritual renewal.
So Yom Kippur was about much more than just one day of rituals. It was about instilling a mindset, a way of life.
Exactly. It reminds us that the journey toward holiness, toward a right relationship with the divine, is an ongoing process, requiring continual effort and self-reflection.
So far, we've been focusing on these intricate rituals and their symbolism. But in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how the core principles of Yom Kippur, reflection, repentance, and atonement, can be applied in our own lives, even outside of a religious context.
Because ultimately the power of Yom Kippur It lies not just in its historical significance, but in its timeless relevance to the human condition.
We'll be right back after a short poke.
Sounds good.
So we've been unpacking these ancient rituals from Leviticus, but it's striking how relevant the themes of Yom Kippur still are today.
What's fascinating is that even though the temple in Jerusalem no longer stands, and the sacrificial rituals aren't performed the way they once were, the spirit of Yom Kippur, it's very much alive.
So what does a modern-day Yom Kippur look like for those who observe it?
Well, the core principles remain the same. It's a day of intense self-reflection, repentance, and seeking forgiveness. It's still observed as a day of fasting from sunset to sunset.
That physical act of abstaining from food and drink, it must really intensify the focus on spiritual matters.
Absolutely. It's about creating that space for introspection, for confronting, those parts of ourselves we might usually avoid. And instead of animal sacrifices, the focus is now on prayer and confession.
So people gather in synagogues to pray for forgiveness.
Yes, but it's not just about asking God for forgiveness. It's also about acknowledging the wrongs we've committed against others.
Yeah.
And actively seeking to make amends. Yom Kippur emphasizes reconciliation on both levels, with God and with our fellow human beings.
So there's a real emphasis on personal responsibility and accountability then. It's not just about saying a few prayers and hoping for the best.
Exactly. It's a day for taking ownership of our mistakes and committing to becoming better people, not just for ourselves, but for the sake of our relationships and the community as a whole.
You know what strikes me is how much these themes resonate. With so many different spiritual and philosophical traditions, this idea of self-reflection, repentance, and seeking atonement, it seems pretty universal, doesn't it?
It really does. I think that's why Yom Kippur continues to speak to people, even if they don't observe it in the traditional sense. It taps into something fundamental about the human experience. We all make mistakes, we all have regrets, and we all yearn for a sense of renewal and second chances.
So even if we don't fast or go to synagogue, we can still find ways to tap into the essence of Yom Kippur in our own lives.
Absolutely. It's about creating space for honest self-reflection, asking ourselves the tough questions. Where have I fallen short? Have I caused harm intentionally or unintentionally? What patterns of behavior do I want to change?
It's about more than just thinking happy thoughts. It's about having the courage to confront those less than flattering aspects of ourselves.
And that's where real growth begins. That willingness to look inward, to acknowledge our imperfections. It's the first step toward positive change.
There's a line in the source material that really struck me. Purity is the preparation for blessing. What do you think that means in a practical sense?
That's a powerful statement. And I think it speaks to the idea that we can create the conditions for blessings to enter our lives by purifying ourselves, both physically and spiritually.
So it's not just about avoiding negative consequences, but about actively cultivating a state of being that's receptive to goodness and grace.
It's about aligning ourselves with a higher purpose, with our values, and becoming more open to experiencing the positive aspects of life.
And that brings us back to atonement, right? Through atonement, we're essentially clearing away those things that block us from experiencing those blessings, those positive connections.
Exactly. It's about removing the obstacles, the negative patterns, the grudges we hold, the harmful behaviors that keep us separate from our better selves and from experiencing true fulfillment.
It's not about dwelling in guilt or shame, but about taking those steps to make things right, both within ourselves and in our relationships with others.
It's about restoration and renewal, coming back into right relationship with ourselves, with others, and with whatever we hold sacred.
I'm starting to see how this all ties together. Yom Kippur, with its emphasis on reflection, repentance, and atonement, it ultimately points us toward a path of personal transformation and spiritual growth.
And it's a journey we can all embark on. Regardless of our religious beliefs or background, the principles of Yom Kippur offer a roadmap for living more intentionally, ethically, and compassionately.
In a way, it's like a yearly reminder to hit the reset button, to take stock of our lives and recommit to becoming the best versions of ourselves.
And in doing so, we open ourselves to experiencing a deeper sense of purpose and meaning, a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves.
It's incredible how these ancient rituals, when examined closely, reveal such profound insights into the human condition.
It speaks to the enduring power of these themes, how they resonate across cultures and time periods. The desire for forgiveness, for renewal, for making things right. It's something we all share.
And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some practical ways we can integrate these principles into our daily lives, even outside of a religious context. How can we take these ancient ideas and make them relevant for us today? Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Yom Kippur. We've explored the history, the symbolism, and even the modern-day relevance of this really powerful tradition. But now I want to get practical, How can we actually apply these ancient principles
No,
of reflection, repentance, and atonement in our own lives?
it's a great question. And I think it's important to remember that you don't have to be Jewish or observe the rituals in a traditional sense to benefit from the wisdom of Yom Kippur. These things are universal and can enrich anyone's life. So where do we even begin? It can feel kind of daunting, right? I know I should reflect more, but where do I start? And what does repentance even look like in a practical day-to-day sense?
Yeah, you're right. It can feel overwhelming if you think about it as this big once-a-year event. But what if we approached it as an ongoing practice, something we weave into our daily lives?
Okay, I like that. Break it down into smaller, more manageable pieces.
Exactly. So let's start with reflection. At its core, it's about taking a pause, creating space for honest self-assessment. It's about asking yourself those tough questions. Where have I fallen short? Have I caused harm, even unintentionally? What patterns of behavior do I want to change?
So it's not about beating yourself up, but about being honest and acknowledging where you have room for improvement.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It requires courage to really look inward and confront those aspects of ourselves we might prefer to avoid, but that's where real growth begins.
And once you've done that inner work, that honest reflection, that's where repentance comes in, right?
Yes. And repentance is more than just feeling remorseful. It's about taking responsibility for your actions and making a conscious decision to change. It's about turning that insight into action.
So it's not enough to just say, I'm sorry. You have to actually do something to make amends.
Exactly. And those actions can take many forms. Apologizing sincerely to someone you've wronged, making restitution for any harm you've caused, and perhaps most importantly, actively working to change those behaviors that led you astray in the first place.
I'm starting to see how these concepts, while rooted in ancient tradition, are actually very practical and applicable to modern life. And that brings us to atonement, which I think is often misunderstood.
It is. Atonement isn't about punishment or dwelling in guilt. It's about reconciliation, about healing the brokenness, both within yourself and in your relationships.
So it's about finding a way to move forward with a clear conscience and a renewed sense of purpose.
Exactly. And that could be a process, not a single event. It requires patience, humility, and a willingness to forgive both yourself and others.
So we've got these three key elements: reflection, repentance, and atonement. But how do we actually integrate them into our, busy lives? Any practical tips?
Well, for reflection, even just 5 minutes of quiet contemplation at the end of each day can make a difference. Use that time to review your day, acknowledge any mistakes, and think about how you might do things differently tomorrow.
Like a mini Yom Kippur every day. I like that.
And for repentance, think about concrete actions you can take to make amends for any harm you've caused. It doesn't have to be grand gestures. Even small acts of kindness and generosity can go a long way in repairing relationships and making the world a better place.
And what about atonement? How do we cultivate that sense of inner peace and reconciliation?
Atonement often involves forgiveness. And remember, forgiveness is a gift you give yourself as much as you give it to others. It allows you to let go of the past and move forward with a lighter heart. Sometimes it might require seeking professional help to address deeper issues.
That's a good point. It's okay to ask for help on this journey of self-improvement.
Absolutely. And remember, you're not alone in this. We all make mistakes. We all have regrets. But we also all have the capacity for growth, for change, for becoming better versions of ourselves.
So by embracing these principles of Yom Kippur, we're essentially embarking on a journey of continuous self-improvement, of becoming more aligned with our values and aspirations.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, our imperfections, and our potential for goodness.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. Imagine if we all approached each day with a bit of that Yom Kippur spirit, that willingness to reflect, to make amends, to strive for something better.
What a powerful thought. And I truly believe that if we all embrace these principles, even in small ways, it could have a ripple effect, creating a more compassionate and understanding world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the meaning and relevance of Yom Kippur.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep striving to become the best versions of yourselves.